With one last glance around, he climbed back into his cruiser and flicked off the flashing lights. He placed the file on the passenger seat, staring at it like it might disappear. His hands were still shaking. He took a deep breath, reached over, and carefully pulled back the flap. Inside were pages of classified reports, grainy surveillance photos, and names of people he recognized. City officials, officers from his own department, and beneath them, handwritten notes detailing disappearances, unsolved cases, investigations that had quietly been shut down. Daniel's stomach churned. It was all there. Corruption, cover-ups, proof that the town he had sworn to protect was hiding something far worse than he ever imagined. And the man he had pulled over, he wasn't just some agent passing through. He had been here for a reason, to handle it. A wave of unease settled over him. What was he supposed to do with this? Who could he even trust? His first instinct was to call someone, but then he realized there was no one. If this file was real, then everyone around him could be compromised. He let out a slow breath, gripping the steering wheel. He had spent years thinking he knew how the world worked, but tonight had changed everything. As he pulled onto the road, one thought ran through his mind. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and he had just stepped through one he might never escape. Reynolds felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. His entire career, his entire identity, was hanging in the balance. He could fight this. He could deny everything, push back, walk away. Or he could face the truth. A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, Reynolds took a slow breath, his hands unclenched. And in that moment, he made his choice. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, a voice cut through the air. "Officer Reynolds." They all turned. Standing on the sidewalk was the young man from the photo, the same one Reynolds had stopped months ago. And the look on his face said everything. The story wasn't over yet. Reynolds felt his chest tighten as he locked eyes with the young man. He looked different now, not just older, but more sure of himself. There was no fear in his stance this time, only quiet recognition. The street felt eerily still as everyone waited for what would happen next. The captain turned to the young man and gave a small nod. "I asked him to come," he said, glancing at Reynolds. "I thought you should meet him again, under different circumstances." Reynolds' throat felt dry. He wanted to say something, but what could he say? Sorry, didn't mean to, none of it felt like enough. The young man took a step forward. "Do you even remember me?" His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something that told Reynolds that Stop had stayed with him for a long time. Reynolds swallowed hard. He did remember. Not just the stop, but the way the kid had looked at him, confused, scared, unsure why he was being treated like a suspect. "I remember," Reynolds said, his voice lower than he expected. The young man studied him and nodded. "That night, I went home and told my dad what happened. You know what he said?" He let the words hang before answering his own question. He said, "You met one of the bad ones tonight. But not all of them are like that." He tilted his head. I wasn't sure if he was right. Reynolds felt something shift inside him, something he couldn't ignore anymore. Monroe crossed her arms. "So, Officer Reynolds, what now?" The question wasn't just about this moment. It was about everything. About who he was before today and who he would be after. Reynolds let out a slow breath. He thought about the badge on his chest, what it was supposed to mean. Then he looked at the young man again. "I don't know if I can fix what happened that night," he admitted, "but I can make sure it doesn't happen again." The captain gave a small nod, as if that was the only answer he had been waiting for. The young man studied Reynolds for a moment longer, then simply said, "I hope so." And with that, he turned and walked away. Reynolds stood there, watching him go, knowing he would never forget this moment. He had spent years believing he was doing the right thing, but today had changed everything. And now, it was up to him to decide what kind of officer he would be tomorrow. 2 years. The captain nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. And in those 2 years, how many times have you pulled someone over because you had an asterisk feeling asterisk? Reynolds hesitated. He knew the truth, but saying it out loud was different. I don't know. The captain nodded again, as if he expected that answer. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. Let me ask you something, Reynolds. If I were a white man, dressed the same way, driving the same car, would we be standing here right now? Reynolds' stomach tightened. His mouth felt dry. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that. But deep down, something told him the truth wasn't so simple. A radio crackled in the patrol car, but neither of them moved. Across the street, an older woman peered out from behind her curtain watching them. Reynolds knew how this looked. He knew what people would assume. The captain followed his gaze, then shook his head. This moment, right here, this is why people don't trust us. His words were sharp, but not cruel. Just honest. You ever think about that? Reynolds clenched his jaw. He had thought about it, but not like this. Not with himself in the middle of it. The captain sighed again, rubbing his temple like a man who had dealt with this too many times before. You got a choice, Reynolds. You can walk away from this and pretend it never happened. Or, he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Or you can learn from it. Reynolds swallowed hard. What do you mean? The captain studied him for a long moment. I'm not filing a report. Not yet, but that doesn't mean this is over. Reynolds' heart pounded. He should have felt relieved, but instead, a new kind of fear settled in, because now he wasn't just facing a mistake, he was facing the truth. And the truth had a way of changing everything. Reynolds felt his pulse hammering in his ears. His instincts told him to walk away, to nod and say, "Yes, sir," and put this behind him. But the captain's stare held him in place. There was something about the way he said asterisk, "This isn't over asterisk." It wasn't a threat. It was a challenge. A voice crackled over the radio again, snapping Reynolds out of his thoughts. His partner was checking in. He glanced at his car, tempted to respond, to shift the moment away from the tension pressing down on him. But the captain wasn't giving him an escape. He stood firm, waiting. Then the captain did something Reynolds didn't expect. He pulled out his phone and started dialing. Reynolds felt his stomach drop. Who was he calling? His superior? Internal affairs? His heart pounded as he fought the urge to stop him. But when the captain finally spoke into the phone, his words caught Reynolds off guard. "Yeah, it's me," he said. "I need you to come down here, now." Reynolds frowned, confused. The captain wasn't reporting him. He was calling someone in. But who? Minutes passed, dragging painfully slow. The air between them grew heavier. Reynolds shifted on his feet, trying to shake the unease growing inside him. The captain just stood there, arms crossed, unreadable. Then a car pulled up. Not a patrol car, but a sleek black sedan. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a sharp suit, moving with a kind of confidence that made Reynolds feel even smaller. Reynolds stiffened. He recognized him immediately. Deputy Chief Sanders, one of the highest-ranking officers in the department. His throat went dry. This wasn't just a lesson anymore. This was something bigger. The deputy chief walked straight to the captain and shook his hand. Then he turned, eyes locking onto Reynolds with an expression that sent a chill down his spine. "You must be Reynolds," Sanders said, his voice calm but firm. "I hear we need to have a conversation." Reynolds didn't dare move. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this the end of his career? A formal reprimand? Worse. The captain finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying more weight than any shouting ever could. "This is the part where you decide what kind of officer you really want to be." Reynolds swallowed hard, realizing there was no turning back now. Whatever was about to happen next, it was going to change everything. Reynolds' hands felt clammy as he stood there, trapped between the captain and the deputy chief. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, like they were peeling back every layer of who he thought he was. The street around them seemed to shrink, the noise of passing cars fading into the background. Deputy Chief Sanders took a step closer. "Tell me, Officer Reynolds," he said, his voice measured, "if we pulled the body cam footage from this stop, would it match the story you'd write in your report?" It was just another night on the job for Officer Daniels, patrolling the quiet streets of his small town. The red and blue lights reflected off the rear window of the sleek black car he had just pulled over. He had no idea that this routine stop was about to turn his entire world upside down. As he stepped out of his cruiser, his boots crunched against the pavement. His hand hovered near his holster, not out of necessity, but out of habit. The driver, a well-dressed black man in his mid-40s, sat calmly behind the wheel, his hands resting on the dashboard before Daniels could even say a word. The man's confidence was unsettling. There was no fear, no panic, just a quiet patience, as if he had been through this before. Daniels cleared his throat. "License and registration." His tone was firm, but the slight edge in his voice gave away something else, an expectation, maybe even a desire for control. The man let out a slow breath before speaking. "Of course, officer. May I reach for my wallet?" His voice was measured, steady. Daniels nodded, watching closely as the man moved, but something felt off. The expensive suit, the sharp eyes, the calmness. This wasn't just any driver. Daniels had dealt with plenty of people in his career, but this man had an air about him. As the officer glanced at the ID handed to him, his face tightened, his stomach flipped. The name, the agency, his pulse picked up speed. The driver met his gaze, his lips curling into a knowing smirk. "Something wrong, officer?" Daniels swallowed hard. He had spent years in uniform, thinking he had control over every situation, every person he encountered. But standing there, holding that ID in his shaking hands, he realized this wasn't just another traffic stop. This was something else entirely, and he had just made a mistake he might not be able to take back. Daniel's grip on the ID tightened. His mind raced as he stared at the name printed on the card. He had pulled over plenty of people in his time, but never someone like this. Never someone with those 3 letters under their name, CIA. The man in the driver's seat watched him closely, his expression unreadable. He didn't look nervous or defensive. If anything, he looked amused, like he had been through this before, like he already knew how this was going to play out. Daniels cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "What brings you out here tonight?" His voice wasn't as steady as he wanted it to be. The man didn't answer right away. He adjusted his watch, taking his time before finally speaking. "Just passing through. Is there a problem, officer?" Daniels didn't know how to respond. He had pulled the man over for a minor traffic violation, but now that felt like an excuse. A cover for something else, something deeper. He glanced at the ID again. The name was unfamiliar, but the weight behind it was impossible to ignore. The CIA didn't just let anyone carry their badge. 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind. Was this guy really an agent? If so, what was he doing here? Was he on some kind of mission? Daniel's gut told him he had just stepped into something way bigger than a simple traffic stop. He stole another glance at the man's face. There was something unsettling about his calmness. Most people in this situation would be tense, defensive, maybe even angry. But this man, he looked like he was waiting for something. The silence stretched between them. The flashing lights of the cruiser cast airy shadows across the pavement. Daniels could feel the weight of his own badge pressing against his chest. He had spent years upholding the law, believing he was the one in control. But now, standing here, facing a man whose past and purpose were completely unknown to him, he wasn't so sure. Daniels had started this night, thinking it would be just another routine stop. Now, he wasn't sure if he had just pulled over the wrong man, or the most dangerous one. Daniels felt a bead of sweat form at his temple, but he didn't dare wipe it away. He was too focused, too locked in on the man sitting calmly before him. Something about this whole situation didn't feel right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He had run hundreds of traffic stops, but this one was different. It wasn't just the ID or the fact that the man had barely blinked since handing it over. It was the way he carried himself, like he knew exactly how this was going to end. The radio on Daniel's shoulder crackled to life. Unit 4, status check. Daniels hesitated. Normally he would have responded without thinking, but something told him that whatever he said next mattered. He glanced at the driver, who was now watching him even more closely, almost like he was listening to the radio too.